Hi, welcome to the Worldwide Storytelling Cafe. I must say it's a pleasure to be telling you stories today. And I thank John Rowe and all the other people who've been putting this together for us to enjoy over the last few weeks. My name's Carl Merry. I'm based in Essex. So I'm going to be doing some of my favourite stories from Essex and the East Anglian region, and I might slip in a Welsh one as well, being Welsh. So the first story concerns a Barbary serpent, a dragon, a worm, an evil creature. It was a dark, cold winter's night, and the Barbary merchants decided it was too dangerous to stay out at sea. So they pulled into the Thames and sailed up past Southend-on-Sea until they got to nice, sheltered, calm water, and there they anchored and the crew slept. Now, had they been awake, and had one of them been on lookout on deck, then they might have seen a great big coil that they thought was rope begin to uncoil, and a great serpent, a great worm, raise its head and slip over the side of the boat down into the cold, icy waters of the Thames. And the serpent swam up, its great length behind it, swam up the Thames, but the water was far too cold for a creature used to much warmer climes. And eventually it dragged itself out onto a sandy area, and there it curled itself up once more in a coil and went to sleep. Well, when morning came, it had no intention of going back in that cold water, and so it headed inland, across fields, where it came across sheep and cows, and there its hunger was assuaged. It began to eat everything in its path, until it, in the middle of the day, came to West Horndon, not so far from where I live actually. And there in the village of West Horndon, it slipped under the lych gate of a churchyard, wandered amongst the gravestones, and curled itself up in a coil to sleep behind a tomb, completely out of sight. Well, little Mary, it was blackberry picking time, and she decided that she was going to leave her house that morning with a basket under her arm, and she would pick as many blackberries as she possibly could. She was sure her mother would be keen to bake a nice pie, and she was looking forward to it, truth to be told. And she went to all the usual places around the village, but it seemed other people had got there first. There were slim pickings of blackberries. Disappointed, she began to make her way home. And it wasn't until she passed that very lych gate of the churchyard that she remembered the great big blackberry bush at the back of the church. And so she walked in. She walked into that churchyard, singing and skipping, and woke that dreadful creature from behind the tomb. And the serpent, it stuck up its head, looked over the tomb, and those baleful eyes fixed upon the little girl. She screamed, dropped her basket of blackberries, and ran out. She ran out of the churchyard, through under the lych gate, all the way to the village, and there she saw her father who was making his way to the local inn. And she told him what she'd seen. come quick, come in, let's talk to people, let's tell them of the danger. And he dragged her into the inn, and he gathered the men of the village around him. And he said, my Mary, she's seen a dragon, she's seen a worm, she's seen a serpent. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? It'll kill us all. Well, the men got together as men will, and they talked, and they discussed, and they argued, and they drank some more, and none of them, not a single man, felt that they were brave enough to tackle this creature, this dragon, this serpent. Until one, perhaps a little more sober than the rest, said, well, we should send up to the big house, the Heron Hall. After all, Sir James Tyrrell is lord of the manor here, and it's he who should be the great slayer of a dragon, not us ordinary men. After all, he's a knight, and those stories from long ago of knights killing dragons, he should be the one to kill the dragon. And so it was, a deputation was sent up to Heron Hall. And when the door was opened, Sir James Tyrrell stood there. Well, the years had not been kind to him. He was 63 years old, and truth to tell, he wasn't in fighting fit form. But it was explained to him that he was lord of the manor, and it was his duty as a knight to go and slay the dragon. And so he agreed to do it. He agreed to go and fight this worm. His wife looked askance at him, but she helped him on with the armour. She buckled him into it. It didn't fit that well, a bit tight round the chest and the stomach. Finally, he was arrayed in all his armour, and he put on his helmet, and he raised the visor, and he looked at himself in the mirror. Not too bad, he thought. Then he took down the mirror, turned it round, and hung it by its chain, so it dangled over his chest, and he picked up his sword. What do you think you're doing? Said his wife. Why the mirror? He said, don't you know about dragons? Don't you know about these worms? They're terribly, terribly vain. And if they see their reflection in a mirror, they'll be all, and they'll pause just long enough so I can cut off its head. And with that, he strode out of his hall. He walked down to the village where everyone was waiting. They clapped him as he went through the village. He made his way to the churchyard where Mary had seen this evil creature. And the creature, now fully awake, was moving about the churchyard looking again for something to eat. And it saw Sir James Tyrrell. Thought perhaps he was tinned food, I don't know. But he made his way towards Sir James Tyrrell, and then he saw his reflection in the mirror, and he just paused. And that pause was enough. Sir James swept his sword and cut off the head of that creature. And the head rolled towards the lich gate. Sir James Tyrrell, when he walked back through the village, once more there was clapping, but this time there was also cheering. He made his way all the way up to Heron Hall, to his wife, who smiled and greeted him, quickly unbuckled his armour, and then she thrust her arms around him and she gave him the biggest hug. Now, I can't say whether it was the strength of the hug or the exertion of fighting in armour and walking up and down to the village, which must have been a good mile and a half there and a mile and a half back. But at that moment, Sir James Tyrrell dropped dead. And if that isn't sad enough, his son, who had been so excited that his father had killed a dragon, he ran down from Heron Hall to see the head of the dragon. And he ran in, didn't see the head under the lich gate, tripped and broke his leg. Well, of course, he was carried back to the Heron Hall, but, well, his leg became infected and had to be amputated eventually. And it didn't go too well, as operations didn't in those days, and he too died. But Sir James Tyrrell's wife, she had the whole thing commemorated in a stained glass window at Heron Hall, where you could see her brave, brave husband, Sir James, cutting off the head of the dragon. Strange thing about that story is, I've been telling it for some time, and last November I was telling it to a historical group, and I had a lady come up to me afterwards and say she was descended from Sir James Tyrrell, and they had many, many stories about Sir James. For instance, some people say that he was only going to kill this dragon to get in good with the king, because his family had been barred from court ever since one of the ancestors had accidentally shot William Rufus in the New Forest. Maybe mistaken him for a red squirrel or something. I couldn't say. She said she knew that story, but she'd never heard of him fighting a dragon. It does happen sometimes that you meet people, if your stories are rooted in history, that have some connection with the stories. The next story is also about a real person from Essex, and that is James Morel, known as Cunning Morel, a white witch, a wizard. He called himself the Devil's Master, and he would do all manner of things for local people in Hadley and Leigh-on-Sea. And he would have people come down from London to consult with him. They said he had great powers. Well, the story I'm going to tell you is called The Heart of Thorns, and it starts on a December night, a few nights before Christmas Eve. The snow had been falling for many, many days, and it was quite thick in the streets of Hadley. And most of the parishioners, including the young people, were inside the church, decorating it for the carol service, which was to take place the next day. And Rosie was convinced she had the best job of all. For she was there laying out the nativity scene with these beautifully carved wooden figures, and she was placing them here and placing them there until she got it just right. And then she took 3 candles and lit the candles and illuminated the scene. She looked to see how the shadows fell. Was that quite right? She moved a figure, she moved a candle, and when she got it just perfect, she turned round to tell her friends. But so intent had she been on her work, she had not noticed everybody gone. She was there alone, but she looked at the scene she'd created, and she smiled to herself, and she put on her thick winter coat and began to walk up the aisle towards the door. But the door was part open, and through that door she saw her boyfriend Frank, and he had in his arms another girl, Elizabeth. And he was kissing her, and they were whispering to each other as lovers might. And poor old Rosie's heart broke in her breast, and she sat in the pews, and she sobbed, she wept, bitter, bitter tears. All the time she could hear the whispering and the kissing going on in the church porch, until finally, after what seemed to her like an eternity, she heard the sound of their feet moving out to the church porch, and she heard the crunch of their footsteps on the new fallen snow. Well, she waited a little longer, and a little longer, until she was certain they'd gone, and then she came out of the church, closed the door, and made her way home. She rushed open the door of her parents' house, slammed it behind her, rushed up the stairs to her bedroom, not speaking at all to her parents, who were sat in their living room, looking at each other and wondering why the haste, why Rosie had not spoken to them. But up in her bedroom, Rosie undressed, she put on her nightie, and she got into her bed. And tears came once more. She sobbed, she wailed, she cried until her pillow was so wet you could wring it out. It was clear there was going to be no sleep to come to her that night. And so she got out of her bed, and she sat at her little table by her window, and she looked out through the now lightly falling snow, and she looked across at the silhouette, the dark shape of Hadley Castle, the ruins of Hadley Castle. And as she watched, she saw a figure come round the side of it, a small figure, and he seemed to be carrying a basket under his arm and an umbrella, and he was wearing one of those hard glazed tile hats, the sort that sailors wore in the 18th century. And she watched as he paused, took a tool out of the basket, knelt in the snow and scraped the snow away, and then dug something up. And she thought to herself, it's the cunning man. It's Morel. He'll be able to help me. And so she went back to her bed, and this time sleep did come to her. In fact, she didn't wake until she heard her mother knocking on her bedroom door and calling her to get up to go to church. But Rosie thought quickly and called back that she was too ill, that she caught a cold that night in the cold church, but that her parents should go because the singing of the choir was so beautiful. They shouldn't miss this carol service. And so her parents left the house and went off to St. James's Church in Hatley. As soon as they'd gone, Rosie got up, dressed herself, put on her boots, put on her thick coat, and she made her way through the village to the cunning man's house. And when she got there, she rapped upon the door, and it was opened by James Morel himself, who said, "Rosie, it's Rosie, isn't it? What can I do for you? Come in." She went into his house, and immediately she went into the house, she could smell dried herbs. He took her down a little passageway, and he took her into this room, and the room, well, from the ceiling, everywhere was hanging dried herbs and dried flowers. all there, that so the cunning man could make his medicines and potions. And every flat surface was covered with books. Some were proper printed books all the way from London. And others, well, they were covered in small, fine, spidery writing of black ink. And they were the books that Morel himself had written in. Now what can I do for you, my girl? Said Morel. She explained about Frank and Elizabeth. And he asked her questions. He asked her date of birth, Frank's date of birth. He asked about Elizabeth, about Frank. He asked about her family. And he made notes all the time she was speaking in one of his little notebooks. Finally, he put it down and said, "Very well, this is what you must do." And he went to a cupboard and he took down a box. From the box, he took out a handful of thorns from the dog rose. And he said, "Now, you must go home and you must cut out a heart from red flannel. And on the next full moon, you must lay that heart under the light of the full moon. And you must thrust these thorns into it. One thorn for every letter of your rival's name." And he gave her 9 thorns for every letter in the name Elizabeth. And she gave him a farthing, and she left happier than she'd been for some time. Well, the next full moon wasn't until New Year's Eve. And on that night, sure enough, early the full moon was shining. And Rosie, she sat at her window in her bedroom and she watched as carts brought the young women up to the church. She saw them coming up the hill with young men walking alongside, talking to the lady of their choice, and Frank was talking to Elizabeth. And a single tear fell down her cheek. But she gave them plenty of time, and then after half hour, an hour or so, she put on her coat, put on her boots, and she herself walked up to the churchyard. And she sat there with her back against the gravestone. And she listened to the music and the laughter and the sounds of dancing in the church hall. But in the hour that she'd waited, clouds had covered the moon. And though she laid out the red flannel heart upon the grass, there was no light of the moon to start this magic by. She sat and she waited. I don't know how long she waited. It seemed to be forever. But finally the clouds parted. The moon shone down on that little churchyard in Hadley. And Rosie took out the thorns and began to plunge them into the red flannel heart. E-L-I, until she got to the final one. H! And with that, there was an enormous crash and a bang, and Rosie fainted straight away. And she was laid there on the grave with her head against the gravestone. And the next thing she remembered was strong arms lifting her up. And when she opened her eyes, she was looking into the eyes of Frank, the man she loved. Rosie, my dear, my darling, when I came out and I saw you there, I thought you were dead. I thought I would never be able to tell you how much I love you. And Rosie, she looked into his eyes. She looked deep into his eyes, and she could see the truth behind his words. And Frank carried Rosie out of the churchyard, down towards her house. When they were halfway down, when out of a side street came a little man, carrying a basket. On his head, a hard glazed tiled hat, the sort that sailors wore in the 18th century. And over the shoulder, Rosie saw him. And Morel saw her, and he just nodded. Well, it's a happy story. So Frank and Rosie were married and lived together contentedly till the end of their days. Morel's magic had worked again. But those of you that are perhaps a little sceptical might say then, well, if that cannon hadn't fired, as it often did at midnight on New Year's Eve, well, Frank would never have found her and thought she was dead. So take your pick. Morel's magic or pure coincidence? Now the next story is a story that I've adapted and changed and added to. A version of this story you'll find in Sabine Baring-Gould's 19th century novel Morel, which is set on Mersey Island in Essex. For those of you who don't know who Sabine Baring-Gould is, he wrote over 100 books. His book of vampires is particularly difficult to read, but he also wrote Onward Christian Soldiers. He was a man of many parts. So this is the story of the mound in Mersey. Because Mersey Island can only be reached by a single road, which is called the Scrood. And at high tides, it can't be reached at all. In fact, it's said that there's a Roman centurion that walks along that Scrood at various times, but that's by the by, and not relevant to the story. And if you cross the Scrood, and don't turn left towards West Mersey, where most people live, but don't turn right to East Mersey, where most people live, but turn left. Before you go very far, you will find a great big mound, a burial mound. And the story concerns that burial mound and how it got there. There was once a Viking chief who raided the east coast of England up and down for a number of years, and on one raid he'd taken an Essex girl to be his wife. And in time, that woman gave him twin boys. 2 boys born at the same time, under the same skies, under the same stars. And they were as alike as 2 peas in a pod, as people say. And they grew to be strong, sturdy little lads. And their father made sure that they were taught all the skills of a Viking warrior. They would practice with swords and spears and shields and axes. They would spar with each other. But they were so alike. Neither could get the upper hand on the other. They were each as skillful, as strong, as swift as the other. And so they would tire themselves out, honing their skills. Well, eventually, they'd grown into young men, and the time came when it does with all young men, when they decided that they needed to show their father that they were at least as good or better than him. And they begged to be allowed to raid the east coast of England. Well, the father was reluctant at first, but he set them a number of tests, all of which they came through, and then he acquiesced and he gave in, and he equipped 20 ships. Oh, he made sure that amidst the crews were battle-hardened, raid-hardened warriors. But also he made sure that there were a number of young, untried warriors. It was good to have the young men away from the village for a time. It was good to see how they would fare. And so the two brothers, each with their own boat, between them commanded the fleet. And they sailed across. They sailed across to England and they raided up and down the coastline, until they sailed into the place we now call St. Osyth. And there they saw the church. And the men went in and began to raid the church, but knelt at the altar in prayer was the saint herself. And the Viking warriors laughed, told her to get up off her knees, but she refused and carried on in her silent prayer. Such was the anger of one of the Viking warriors that he took his great axe and he swept it across, and her head was severed and rolled along the aisle of the church. And then a game ensued. The warriors would pick up the head and throw it to each other, laughing and joking, while other warriors stole the gold and silver. The beautiful golden cross that was on the altar was one of the last things to be stolen. And as a warrior was taking that, he looked down and he saw a foot, a little foot, sticking out from under the altar cloth. And he reached down and pulled out a young woman, the saint's sister. She was so beautiful that the Viking warriors knew that this was no occasion for rapine. They would have to take this one to their leaders, the twin brothers. So they took the young girl to where the ships were moored. And as soon as the two boys saw this girl, these two young men, these twins, these warriors who had never ever had a cross word in their lives, had never argued, each said, "I want her for mine." And the first argument ensued. They pushed and shoved. They cursed. They hit each other. They punched each other. They scrabbled on the ground until separated by their men. Until one of them, the firstborn I believe it was, said, "There's only one way we can settle this. We must fight for her, and the victor can claim her." So next morning, they sailed round a little further to a place now called Monkey Beach. And there they took their shields, their swords and their axes, and on the sand of Monkey Beach they began to fight. But they were so equally matched. Each one was as strong. Each one was as skillful. Each one was as swift as the other. All day long they fought neither gaining the upper hand until, well, evening came and the sun was beginning to sink and their arms were beginning to tire, and each of them raised the sword, swept down, and each young man was too slow with the shield, and each was dealt a mortal wound. They fell dead upon the sands at West Mersey. Well, the crewmen lifted them up, took them onto the boats, tended the wound, made them look presentable, dressed them in their finest war gear. And the next morning, all the crews got together and dragged a Viking ship up the beach, across to the edge of a field. And there they lay one brother down and the other brother down. Then they took the young girl and they chained her right hand to the left wrist of one brother and her left hand to the right wrist of the other. And then they began to pile earth into the boat. They piled the earth high on both the dead and the living. And eventually they created a huge mound that entombed the whole of the ship and the two brothers and the beautiful young sister of St. Osoph. And the mound stands there to this very day. But that's not the end of the story. For it is said that were you to go there on a full moon and put your ear to it, you will hear the sounds of battle, of fighting. Because there is a cycle. As the moon waxes and grows bigger, their bones, long dust, are reformed. Flesh forms upon the bodies of the two young men. Their rusted swords and axes become bright and sharp once more. Their ruined shields strong. And they fight. They fight, and you can hear on that full moon the sound of steel upon steel. You can hear the yelling and the cursing of the two brothers as they fight for the hand of the beautiful young woman. But of course, as the moon wanes, they become weak. Their flesh rots upon their bodies. The swords, the shields, the axes fall to nothing. And finally, the two brothers once more crumbled into dust. But if you were there when the moon has waned completely, and you go to that mound and you put your ear to the sound, to the earth again, you do not hear the sound of battle. You do not hear the cries of the two brothers. What you hear are the screams of the young woman as she is buried alive. You will hear her scream as the earth fills her mouth and her eyes her nostrils and her ears. And that is the story of the Mersey Mound, as I tell it. The mound itself actually contains a Roman burial, and there's some debate about what sort of a burial it is, a man or a woman. There's no evidence, but inside was found a beautiful large glass urn with the ashes of the dead Roman man or woman. But it is strange, isn't it, to have a Roman burial in what looks like a Celtic burial mound. And I could tell you about that, but that would be another story and would take me a long, long time. So those are my stories for today. It's nice to be joining all those wonderful storytellers you've had before. That's a real joy. Don't forget, whether you like my stories or not, there are other storytellers who you could tip in the hats underneath. If you did enjoy my stories, then my hat for contributions will be under my name. It's been a tough time in lockdown. I trust everybody is well, and I trust soon we'll come out of this and we'll be able to share stories in the real world once again. Thank you very much. I'll say goodbye.